They dumped sawdust on your fence for 12 years. But he saw it as an opportunity. Arthur Miller was leaning on his shovel when the dump truck stopped outside the old wooden fence and unloaded another mountain of sawdust right on his property line. The yellow dust rose into the cold Tuesday sky. The smell of damp wood filled the air, and he stood there, watching, without making a sound. It was always like this. 12 years with the same truck, the same dust, the same silent humiliation. 12 years swallowing it all without a word while the neighbor lived comfortably on the other side. But that morning, something that had never happened before happened. Instead of turning his back and walking away as he always did, Arthur let go of the shovel, walked to the fence and put his hand into the freshly dumped sawdust. He felt the material give way between his fingers, noticed the bottom layer was darker, almost warm, with a different smell of wet earth. He stayed crouched there for a time he couldn't measure, looking at that dirty hand, thinking about something that still had no shape, but that somehow was already an idea. A small, fragile idea that he couldn't even name at that moment. But it was an idea, and it was enough to change everything that came next. That morning, Arthur Miller was 42 years old, had a 3-day beard that was turning into a 7-day beard, a stack of bills from the First National Farmers Bank he couldn't pay, and a son who barely spoke to him. The property where he lived was the same one where he had grown up, where he learned to plant with his father, where his mother had raised chickens and made cheese. It was nearly 20 acres of good land at the foot of the hills covered in pines, but in recent years the yield had shrunk and the debts had grown in the opposite direction. He always wore the orange and brown plaid shirt, worn at the elbows, which had belonged to his father, and the jeans that already had a permanent stain on the knee from when he fell fixing the water tank. He was a man of few words and a lot of stubbornness, raised to believe that asking for help was the same as admitting weakness. The neighbor on the other side of the fence was Silas Henderson, owner of the biggest sawmill in the region. The sawmill ran all day, 6 days a week, and produced tons of sawdust as waste. For 12 years, Silas had used the fence on Arthur's property as a convenient dumping spot. At first, Arthur complained. Silas responded with a smile and a technical explanation that Arthur didn't fully understand, but which concluded that the material was harmless and would break down over time. After a few months, the trucks kept coming, and Arthur had given up fighting, not because he agreed, but because Silas Henderson was the kind of man the whole town treated carefully, and Arthur didn't have the energy or the money for a long war with someone so well connected. What few knew was that Arthur had tried to stand up to Silas a second time, about 8 years earlier, when the sawdust started overflowing onto the property during the rains. He went to the sawmill in person early in the morning and asked to speak with the owner. Silas showed up in dress pants and a shirt with an open collar, looked at Arthur as if looking at someone begging, and said in the measured voice of someone used to not being contradicted that the sawdust was organic material, that it would break down over time, and that Arthur was making an unnecessary fuss. On the way back home, one of the sawmill workers followed Arthur, and without looking him in the eye said quietly that it would be better to leave it as is, because the boss had long arms in the town, and that people who tried to fight him had come out at a disadvantage. Arthur was angry at himself for having come home in silence, and he swallowed that anger for 8 more years, week after week, every time a new truck showed up. His son, Caleb, was 22 years old and slept in the room that had always been his, but spent more time on the porch or distracted on his phone than inside the house. He'd tried to study in Asheville 3 years earlier, dropped out after the first semester for lack of money, and come back to the property with a weight on his shoulders he could never quite name. Father and son barely talked, not out of hate, but out of a shared pride neither knew how to bend. Caleb thought his father was too stubborn to accept that the property was sinking. Arthur thought his son was too impatient to understand that you don't abandon the land. And so the two lived side by side, in a silence as thick as years of things left unsaid. The week the mountain of sawdust was dumped for the 12th time in the span of a year, Caleb had found at the bottom of a desk drawer in his father's room the notice from First National Farmers Bank. They were papers with small print and big numbers that he read 3 times before understanding what they meant. The deadline for paying the debt had been 42 days ago. The bank had sent that notice as a final warning before starting the foreclosure process on the property. Caleb stood in the hallway of the house for a while, holding the papers, listening to his father moving around outside. Then he put everything back in the drawer, went out to the porch, and stared at the hills until the sun went down. He didn't say anything that day. He waited 2 days before bringing it up, and when he did, it was during dinner, bluntly. "Dad, I saw the letter from the bank." Arthur stopped eating. He stared at his plate. "So?" he said, without lifting his head. "So we need to talk, because it looks serious. I'm handling it." "You've been handling it for 3 years, and the debt only grew." The silence that followed was the kind that weighs heavy. Arthur put his fork down on the plate slowly, without rushing. "Caleb, this land was your grandfather's. I'm not handing it over to any bank." "I didn't say anything about handing it over. I said we need to talk." "We already talked." Arthur got up, took his plate to the sink, and went out to the porch without looking back. Caleb sat at the table a while longer, staring at the spot where his father had been sitting, then pushed his plate forward with a sigh that had no anger, just exhaustion. It was always like this. There was a wall between the two that had been built brick by brick over the years, and neither knew any more how to start tearing it down. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us folks just starting out a lot, now continuing. Early the next day, while Caleb was still asleep, Arthur went out with the shovel and walked to the edge of the fence. He wanted to check the size of the latest dumping, figure out how many planks were being pressed down and would need repair. But when he got there, instead of feeling the usual anger, he crouched down and began to sift through the sawdust with his hands, layer by layer. The surface was yellow and dry, with that strong smell of freshly processed wood. But as he sank his fingers deeper, the material got darker, denser, with thin white threads he didn't recognize at first. The soil underneath it all, the real soil, had a color Arthur had never seen in over 20 years of working that ground. It was almost black, a dark, soft earth, moist in a way the clay soil of that property had never been in places without sawdust. He stayed there for over half an hour, digging here and there with his hands, running his fingers through the earth, putting some to his nose and sniffing without knowing exactly what he was looking for. It wasn't a discovery yet. It was a question. A question stayed with him as he drove home, as he drank his coffee, as he started his workday. That question lingered there, quiet, waiting for an answer. 3 days later, an answer arrived from where he least expected it. Rachel Taylor stopped the white car at the edge of the dirt road late in the afternoon. She was 38 years old, black hair tied up on top of her head with an elastic band, khaki fabric pants, and field boots with mud on the heels. She worked as a freelance agronomist and was doing a soil survey for some neighboring properties when she noticed something strange while passing by the edge of Arthur's fence. She stopped the car, got out, and stood observing the line of vegetation along the entire stretch where the sawdust had been deposited over the years. The plants grew differently there. The leaves were bigger, greener, and wider than any other plants in the area, and there was a type of spontaneous mushroom sprouting at several points along the base of the fence, which caught her attention immediately. That wasn't normal, and Rachel Taylor knew very well what was normal when it came to soil. Arthur was on the inside of the fence, checking a board when he saw her standing on the outside. He grew suspicious, as was his nature with anyone he didn't know. "Can I help you?" he said, more as a warning than a question. "Good morning," she replied, unfazed by his tone. "I'm an agronomist and I was passing by on the road here. I noticed this vegetation along your fence. May I ask what's in this part of the boundary?" "Sawdust, from the neighbors." "How long has it been here?" Arthur rested his arms on the fence and looked at her carefully. 12 years. Her eyes shifted slightly. She looked at the strip of land with a different kind of attention, as if she were calculating something. "Would you mind if I collected some soil samples here? I won't take long." "What for?" "To understand what's happening with the soil in this area, because what I'm seeing isn't what I'd expect to find, and I don't mean that in a bad way." Arthur was silent for a moment. There was something in the way she said that which didn't sound like the usual chat of a curious person passing by on the road. There was a seriousness in her, a genuine attention to the ground, which was the kind of thing Arthur recognized because he had it himself. "You can collect them," he said. Rachel spent over an hour on the property that day. She collected samples at 5 different points along the fence, jotted everything down in a well-used green notebook, photographed the spontaneous mushrooms from several angles, and measured the height of the plants with a simple tape measure. There was something almost meticulous about the way she worked, as if each detail mattered more than the next. Before she left, she told Arthur that the sample results would take a few days, but that she was curious. "Out of curiosity," she said, before getting into the car, "do you know what kind of wood the sawmill processes?" "Pine, mostly. Oak, too." "That makes sense," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "A lot of sense." She drove away, and Arthur stood at the edge of the road for a while, staring at the dust the car had kicked up, unable to define what he was feeling. Something that wasn't quite hope, but it wasn't the usual resignation either. Caleb had seen the scene from the window. At lunchtime, as the two ate in silence as usual, he asked who the woman was. An agronomist passed by wanting to collect some soil samples. What for? She said something was different about the vegetation. Caleb looked out the window toward the fence. He stared for a moment. "I noticed that too," he said slowly. "A long time ago. The plants by the fence are bigger than the others. They always were." Arthur didn't reply, but something inside him shifted slightly, in such a subtle way he barely noticed himself. 3 days later, Silas Henderson showed up in person at the property for the first time in years. He arrived in a white pickup truck, freshly washed, the engine purring softly, and stepped out of the cab wearing that straw hat that always seemed new and that smile that never reached his eyes. Arthur was fixing a gate when he heard the engine and turned to look. He recognized the truck before he recognized the man. "Arthur," said Silas, walking slowly like a man with no hurry. "How are you?" "What do you want, Silas?" The other man wasn't bothered by the cold reception. He was the type who had learned to treat other people's coldness as a minor obstacle. "I came to talk. I heard things aren't easy for you. The situation is tough for everyone around here, I know that." He paused deliberately. "I came with an offer." Arthur stopped working on the gate and waited, still holding the tool. "I want to buy your property," said Silas, in the tone of someone doing a favor. "I know you have the debt with the bank. I can offer an amount that covers it and still leaves you with something left over. You'd be at peace without that worry hanging over your head." "How much?" Silas pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and handed it over. It was a number written by hand, in the rounded handwriting of a man used to writing offers. Arthur looked at it. He stared for a long time, reading the number twice because the first time he didn't want to believe it. The amount was less than half of what anyone in the region who knew land would know that property was worth. It was an offer that wasn't an offer. It was an insult disguised as a favor. "Are you calling me an idiot?" Arthur said very quietly. Silas's smile stiffened for a second. "I'm being realistic, Arthur. In this situation, you don't have many choices. This amount covers the debt and you can start over somewhere else with what's left." "Start over where? With what?" "That's your problem." Arthur folded the paper in half and handed it back to Silas with a calm that cost him dearly to maintain. "You can leave." The smile vanished for good. "You'll regret turning this down." "You can leave," Arthur repeated in exactly the same tone. Silas walked back to the pickup, started the engine with unnecessary force, and drove off without looking back. Arthur stood in the same spot for a long time, listening to the engine fade down the road, feeling his heart beat faster than it should. There was a threat in that last sentence that needed no explanation to be understood. He had heard threats like that before. Caleb had heard everything from the porch. When the pickup disappeared around the curve of the dirt road, he came down the steps and stood next to his father without saying anything for a moment. "He's going to send more trucks," the young man said finally. "I know," said Arthur. "What are we going to do?" For the first time in a long time, Arthur didn't say he would handle it or tell his son to stop worrying about things that weren't his problem. "We'll wait for the agronomist's results," he replied. Caleb turned to look at his father, slightly surprised by that answer. It was the first time Arthur had included his son in a "we" without Caleb having to assert himself. And that small thing settled between them like a brick taken from the wall in just the right place. And Silas made good on what he had promised without needing to say it. That same week, 2 more trucks came down the dirt road on different days and dumped fresh sawdust along the boundary line, one in the afternoon and another just as dusk was falling. The yellow mountain grew so large that it began to press against the fence boards, snapping one at its weakest point. Caleb photographed everything from the gate with his cell phone. Arthur looked at the photos that night and didn't say a word. The sample results arrived on a Thursday morning. Rachel called before she got there, saying she was coming in person because she wanted to explain the data face to face. There was something in her voice that hadn't been there the first time they spoke, a kind of contained energy that made Arthur pay closer attention than usual. When she parked the car in front of the property and got out with the notebook and an envelope made of thicker paper than last time, there was something different about the way she walked. She got straight to the point as soon as Arthur opened the gate. "The results exceeded what I expected," she said. "Far exceeded it." She opened the envelope and began to explain simply, without using hard-to-understand words. The sawdust deposited over 12 years on the clay soil of that stretch had created a soil transformation process that normally doesn't happen without intense, planned human intervention. The layers of organic material, combined with the natural moisture and the specific temperature of that region, had transformed the soil in an extraordinary way. The organic matter levels along the fence line were 3 times above normal. The soil structure was almost perfect for certain types of cultivation. And there was something else, something she had saved for last. "These mushrooms that appeared spontaneously," she opened one of the photos on her phone, "aren't common mushrooms, they're shiitake mushrooms. And the condition of the substrate in this stretch would be almost ideal for commercial cultivation of special varieties. With the level of organic matter the soil has here, a mushroom cultivation along this strip could be extremely productive." She paused. "Growers pay a lot to artificially build this kind of substrate. You have it ready-made, Arthur, built over 12 years without anyone noticing." There was a silence that lasted longer than any silence usually did on that property. Caleb was leaning against the gate with his arms crossed, looking at her phone with the photos. He uncrossed his arms. "Commercially productive," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. "With low investment and simple setup," she said, "the substrate is already ready. Nature did the hardest work on its own." Arthur looked at the ground. There was something he was trying not to show on his face. "For 12 years, he said, without lifting his head. "He dumped that stuff here for 12 years, and this material turned into that." "That's exactly it." Another silence. "Show me where I'd have to plant," Arthur said, finally lifting his head. Rachel smiled in a way that seemed like she'd been waiting for that question. The 3 of them walked to the fence together. Rachel showed the spots where the soil was richest, measured the length with the tape measure, made marks with wooden sticks she took from her pants pocket. The fertile strip was almost 300 feet long. In several spots, the depth of the good substrate went more than 3 feet. While Rachel explained, Arthur looked at that stretch of land he had looked at with shame for 12 years, and something that still didn't have a full name started to take shape inside him. It was a mix of old anger and something that wasn't exactly joy but was close to it. Caleb remained silent most of the time, but the way he looked at the soil, crouching down every now and then to run his fingers through the dark earth, said more than any words could have. "I can help with the initial technical plan," Rachel said before leaving. "I know the shiitake mushroom cultivation process well. It's not simple, but it's not impossible for someone who already knows how to work the land. And the substrate you have here is something that takes years to build from scratch." "How long would it take to have a first harvest?" Caleb asked. "Depending on the inoculation and the moisture conditions, between 30 and 50 days. The boy looked at his father. Arthur looked at the fence, at the yellow mountain that had grown week after week for 12 years, at the dark earth that had grown beneath it without anyone telling it to. "Then we start today," he said. That afternoon, father and son worked side by side for the first time in a long time. Arthur didn't make any comment about it. He didn't give a speech, didn't offer a handshake. He simply picked up the shovel, walked over to the strip marked by Rachel, and started preparing the ground. Caleb went to get the tools and worked alongside him without asking what he was supposed to do. The conversation they needed to have was still ahead of them, but for now, that was enough. The shovels hitting the same earth was enough. Rachel came back the next day with technical material on cultivation, recommendations on where to buy the inoculation supplies, and a simple sketch of a structure that could be built with what was already on the property without spending more than necessary. They used old slats from the shed that Arthur had been saving without quite knowing why, shadecloth left over from a project years ago, and bamboo cut from the back of the property. The structure turned out simpler than it was pretty, but it was functional. Caleb measured everything twice before nailing anything, which made Arthur look at his son out of the corner of his eye and say nothing. But there was something in that look. The first batch of inoculation was placed carefully, almost in silence. Rachel showed the process step by step, and the two men followed the instructions without question. When it was done, the sun was already dropping behind the hills, and the evening cold was starting to set in. The three of them stood for a moment looking at the simple structure that had risen, where before there had only been the mountain of sawdust and the humiliation. "Now we wait," said Rachel. "We know how to wait," said Arthur, and Caleb almost smiled. The following days were filled with a silent expectation that Arthur hadn't felt in years. He woke up early, went out to the structure, checked the moisture with his fingers, looked for pests, watched the substrate with an attention he had never given any other crop. Caleb stayed up later than usual for 4 nights in a row, researching on his phone about mushroom cultivation, specifically shiitake mushrooms, about the market, about pricing. One morning he showed his father an article about small growers working with mushrooms in the highlands who had managed to make a decent living. Arthur read it slowly, running his finger along the lines as he always did when reading on paper, and then handed the phone back to his son without comment. But that same afternoon he went out to the porch and stood looking at the hills for a long time, with an expression Caleb had never seen on his father's face before. On the 12th day, the first sprouts appeared. They were small, dark, almost inconspicuous in the middle of the substrate. Caleb went out to the structure early in the morning, before breakfast, and crouched there looking at them for a while without calling anyone. When Arthur arrived, his son was still in the same position, elbow resting on his knee and chin in his hand, staring at those little sprouts as if he was afraid they would vanish if he blinked. "Dad," he said without turning around. Arthur came up from behind, looked over his son's shoulder. He stayed silent. The sprouts were too small for anyone who didn't understand the work to pay them any mind, but Arthur had worked the land his whole life, and he knew how to recognize new life when he saw it. Then he placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder without saying a word. Caleb put his hand over his father's for a second before letting it fall, and that was it. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't tears. It wasn't any of those things that in the movies mark the moment when two men who've been fighting make peace. But for anyone who knew those two and understood the weight of the silence that had existed between them for years, that moment was worth more than any speech could ever be. Rachel showed up later and was visibly excited about the sprouts. She said the growth was above expectations for that climate and that the substrate was responding very well. She took pictures, made notes, sent a message to someone Arthur didn't know before putting her phone back in her pocket. "I'd like to show this data to a professor I know," she said to Arthur. "He's a specialist in soil and sustainable agriculture and works at a university around here in the region. This case is unusual, Arthur, very unusual. What happened on this land isn't the kind of thing researchers see every day." "What does that mean for me?" Arthur said bluntly, because that's what really mattered. "It means what you have here might be worth more than just the mushrooms, but I need his opinion before I say more." Arthur nodded, and then, that night, while he was alone on the dark porch after Caleb had gone to sleep, he felt for the first time in years that something had changed. It wasn't certainty. It was less than that. It was more like the feeling that a door that had been shut for 12 years had cracked open, and that on the other side there was enough light to see the next step. But life rarely leaves a crack open for long without someone trying to close it. In the early hours of the 12th day of cultivation, a noise woke Caleb. He lay still in bed for a second, listening carefully, and when he heard it again, he got up in the dark without making a sound and went to the window. The yard was quiet. The moon was high, making the property look pale and strange. But there was something different in the darkness near the cultivation structure, a shadow that moved in a way that wasn't the wind. Caleb grabbed the flashlight that was on the nightstand, slipped on his flip-flops and went to the door. When he opened it, the cold of the early morning hit his face. He stood still for a second, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the darkness outside the window. And then he saw. The cultivation structure was partially destroyed. Broken slats, torn screens, and part of the substrate had been turned over in a way that was clearly not accidental. It wasn't the work of the wind or an animal. Caleb stood looking at it for a moment, flashlight in hand. Then he walked to the fence and pointed the flashlight at the ground outside. In the wet mud along the roadside, there were boot prints, wide, with heavy work soles, with a specific pattern on the sole that he had seen before. The same boots worn by the sawmill workers, which he had seen up close years ago when they went to get some wooden planks for his father and passed by the front of the sawmill. Caleb didn't call his father that early morning. He stayed alone, fixing what he could, replacing broken slats with others from the shed, patching the screen with what he had, replanting the part of the substrate that had been disturbed. He worked until the sun began to rise with cold hands and wet knees, and when Arthur woke up and came to the structure, most of the damage had already been repaired, even if with visible patches like scars. Arthur looked at the structure, at the patches, at his son standing beside him with deep dark circles under his eyes and his clothes stained with dirt. What happened? Caleb told him everything with a calm voice, without exaggerating anything, without leaving anything out. The boot prints, the time, what he had found when he woke up, what he had fixed on his own. Arthur's face grew hard as he listened. It wasn't the explosive anger that fades quickly. It was the other kind, the one that stays. "The boot marks," Arthur said finally. "Are you sure?" "I am." Another silence. A bird sang in the distance. "We're going to replant," Arthur said. "I already replanted what I could." Arthur looked at his son in a way he hadn't in a long time. For a second, something crossed that closed-off face that usually let nothing through. It wasn't just pride. It was recognition. It was seeing in his son something he had tried to pass on without ever knowing how. "Thank you," he said. Caleb turned aside so his father wouldn't see how much that word, spoken that way at that moment, had weighed on him. They replanted that morning with what they had. Rachel, when she found out over the phone, was silent for a moment, and then said with an urgency she tried to hide that she was going to move up the professor's visit. There was something in her voice that said things were becoming more serious than she had initially anticipated. 2 days later, Professor Douglas Vance arrived. He was a man with completely white hair, despite being only in his early 50s, wore round black-rimmed glasses, and carried a notebook that seemed to have survived many fields over many years. He walked slowly along the fence line, stopping every few feet, bending down to pick up soil with his hands, smelling it, rubbing it between his fingers, looking at the sky as if calculating something only he could see. Caleb kept a respectful distance, watching. Arthur stood even farther back, leaning on the fence with his arms crossed, letting the man work without interference. When the professor finished walking the entire length and returned to where the two were standing, there was an expression on his face that Arthur couldn't immediately name. It wasn't exactly excitement. It was more like the look of someone who had just seen something they had been searching for a long time and had begun to think might not exist. "How long did you say you've been getting the sawdust?" he asked Arthur. 12 years. The professor nodded slowly, writing in the notebook. "And the type of wood is pine and oak?" "Yes." Another pause. More notes. "Arthur, what happened on this strip of land is a process that under normal conditions would take 30 to 40 years of intentional, constant human work to occur. The fact that it happened spontaneously in 12 years, given the soil and climate conditions of this particular region, is extraordinary." He paused for a moment. "I've been studying soil for over 20 years, and have never encountered a natural organic transformation of this scale happening without someone guiding the process. Arthur stared at him. "Can I use this to grow mushrooms?" he said, directly, without beating around the bush, because that was what really mattered. The professor almost smiled. "You're already using it. And from the first sprouts Rachel showed me in the photos, it's going very well." He paused. "But there's more, Arthur. This case needs to be documented. Would you allow me to conduct a formal study here? With periodic collections over the next few months? Will the study interfere with the cultivation?" "No, quite the opposite. It will help understand how to expand what you're doing and provide technical support for any conversations you need to have with buyers or partners." Arthur was silent for a moment. "You can do the study," he said. As he signed the authorization the professor had brought on a simple sheet of paper, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't exactly joy. It was more like the weight lifting off a shoulder that had carried it for so long it had almost forgotten what it felt like without it. But later that same day, in the afternoon, when the professor and Fernanda had already left and the sun was beginning to go down, a bus stopped at the edge of the dirt road, and a woman got off with short grey hair, a bag over her shoulder, and an old shoebox under her arm that she carried as if it were fragile. Marcelo recognized her silhouette from a distance. It was Conceição, his sister. She was 54 years old, with the same determination in her eyes as her brother, and a way of walking into a place that made it clear she didn't need permission to exist. She had lived in a neighboring county for 20 years since she got married, but she called Marcelo every week and had been the one to stand by her brother when their mother passed. When she found out from a neighbor's niece that the property situation was critical, she bought a bus ticket the same day, without telling anyone. Marcelo met her at the gate and stood looking at her for a second before opening it. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I did." Lucas greeted his aunt with a hug that lasted longer than usual. She came into the kitchen, placed the shoebox carefully on the table, sat down, looked at the two men with that specific attention of someone who came to help but needs to understand first, and said she wanted to hear everything before she talked about what she had brought. They told her. Marcelo in a few words, Lucas filling in the gaps, the sawdust, the agronomist, the professor, the shoots, the invasion at dawn, Oswaldo's low offer. Conceição listened without interrupting, her elbow on the table and her chin resting on her fist, with a face that said she was saving her comments for later. When they finished, she stayed quiet for a moment that stretched on a bit. Then she pushed the shoebox to the middle of the table. "This was at Mother's house," she said. "When I went to pick up her last things, I kept it because I thought it might be important someday. I never knew when that day would come, but I think it's now." Marcelo looked at the shoebox. "What's in there?" "Open it." He did. Inside were old documents, some with yellowed and brittle edges, some in envelopes, others folded any old way, like someone had stored them in a hurry. In the middle of everything, there was a handwritten receipt, with the small, meticulous handwriting that Marcelo recognized before he even read what it said. It was his father's handwriting. Marcelo picked up the receipt and read it. He read it again. He ran his hand over his beard, while his eyes were still on the paper. "It's from Oswaldo," he said, more to himself than to anyone. "Right," said Conceição calmly. "Dad lent him money 26 years ago, when Oswaldo was still starting up the sawmill and didn't have the capital to buy the necessary equipment." She paused. "Oswaldo never paid it back. Dad never asked because he was ashamed to have a quarrel with someone from the same region. You're just like him in that, Marcelo." Marcelo kept staring at the paper. His father's handwriting trembled a little at the end of the receipt, the way it always had since he got older. There was a separate note on a smaller piece of paper with that same characteristic tremor. "I trusted him because we're from the same land." Lucas was reading over his father's shoulder. He stayed quiet for a while. "That amount," Marcelo said slowly, doing the math in his head, "adjusted for time." "It would be much bigger than the debt to the bank," said Conceição directly. "I'm not saying you should collect. Dad didn't collect, and I know you have his pride. I'm saying you need to know this exists, that you're not completely without resources in this fight." That night, Marcelo stayed on the porch for hours, alone with the receipt in his hand and his gaze lost in the darkness of the hills. Lucas came out once, offered him a cup of hot water, and went back inside without forcing a conversation, because he had learned that his father needed space to process the big things. Mary slept in her mother's room, which Arthur had never changed or put away. When the sun came back, Arthur had deep dark circles under his eyes and a resolve on his face that hadn't been there the day before. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. The following days were filled with constant work, the kind the property hadn't seen in a long time. Rachel and Professor Douglas came over regularly. The cultivation advanced beyond expectations. The mushrooms developed with a vitality that even Rachel admitted was unusual, and the simple structure they'd put together with slats and screens was proving sufficient, and then a little more than sufficient for the first phase. Caleb had started making his own notes in a simple black-covered notebook he found in a drawer. He recorded the conditions each day, the nighttime temperature, the number of emerging mushrooms, observations about the substrate at different points. It was a notebook that had started empty and was filling up at a speed he hadn't expected. There was a quiet satisfaction in it that he couldn't quite name, but that he felt every morning when he opened the notebook and wrote the first entry of the day. One of those afternoons, while the professor was jotting down data at one of the collection stations, he mentioned something in passing that stuck in Arthur's mind like a hook. There's a Blue Ridge Farmers Alliance that's been studying income alternatives for small producers in the mountain region, Douglas said. I'm in touch with them because of another project involving organic production. Can I mention what's happening here? What would they do? Asked Caleb, who was working a few yards away. They'd come see, and if they like what they find, there might be interest in talking about a supply arrangement. Arthur stopped what he was doing for a second. Supply arrangement, he said slowly. Nothing's guaranteed yet, but the visit is worth it. You can mention it, Arthur said. There was something about that word, arrangement, that kept vibrating inside him for the rest of that afternoon. It was a word unlike everything he'd weighed over the past few years. It wasn't a loan, it wasn't a forced sale, it wasn't negotiation with the fence pushing at his pride. It was work. It was the kind of thing he'd done his whole life, and that had seemed to hold no value. The representatives from the cooperative arrived one morning in September. They were two women, both with the practical bearing of people who know the field for real, not from a book. The older one was around 50, black hair streaked with white that she didn't hide, and a questionnaire she'd prepared before arriving. The younger one was quieter, but looked at everything with a focus Arthur recognized as the kind of attention from someone who's actually assessing, not just visiting. They walked along the fertile strip calmly, asked specific questions about the process, about the substrate, about the source of the sawdust. Caleb answered most of the questions with the data he'd recorded in the black notebook. The older representative asked to see the notebook. Caleb handed it over without hesitation. She flipped through it slowly, nodding her head from time to time. Mary had prepared some mushrooms from the most recent batch simply, in a skillet with salt and a drizzle of olive oil, and served them on the porch. The two representatives ate in silence for a moment. Then the older one said she needed to talk to the other members of the cooperative, but she was quite impressed. The younger one said she rarely saw substrate of that quality on a small producer's property. When they left, Arthur stood in the yard staring at the gate for a while. Caleb walked up to him. "What do you think?" the son asked. "I think we did everything right," Arthur said. "Now we wait." But the waiting had a bitter taste before it had any other taste. 2 days after the representative's visit, a rumor began to circulate in the small town 12 miles from the property. It was the kind of town with a central market, a bakery that also sold medicine, and a gas station where news arrived before the newspapers. The rumor said that the mushrooms produced on Arthur Miller's property were of questionable quality, that the substrate was made from sawmill waste that might be contaminated with products used in wood processing. No one could say where the information had come from, but it was being said, and in a small town, that was enough to cause damage. The Blue Ridge Farmers Alliance called the next day. The older representative, in a voice that tried to be professional but sounded uncomfortable, said that information had reached them from various sources, and that they needed technical clarifications before proceeding with any agreement. They weren't backing out entirely, just asking for time. Arthur held onto the phone for a long time after the call ended. He stared at the device as if he could see through it. Caleb was in the kitchen and had heard the conversation. When his father set the phone on the table, they were both silent for a moment. "It was Silas," Caleb said. Caleb, "I know. And now?" Arthur stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the yard. "Now we prove the rumor is a lie." He called Professor Douglas that same afternoon. He explained what had happened in a controlled voice, as if holding a lot inside. Douglas listened in silence, then said he would prepare a full technical report with all the data from the collected samples, attesting to the quality and safety of the substrate. He said it would take 3 days to do it right. 3 days that Arthur spent working as usual, not talking about it with anyone outside the family. Mary, who had stayed on for a few more days, observed everything in silence and helped where she could, in the kitchen, organizing the records Caleb had started, and fixing the small gate that no one had had time to repair. Caleb went into town on the second day to pick up supplies and heard with his own ears people whispering about it in the market while he waited in line. An older woman told another that she'd heard the Miller property was having problems with the mushrooms. The other nodded, as if she already knew. Caleb left the market with his stomach churning and didn't say a word to his father about what he'd heard. But it stayed with him for the rest of that day and through the next night, growing in a way he tried to ignore but couldn't. On the morning of the third day, while he was having coffee and his father hadn't yet come out of the bedroom, Caleb made a decision he hadn't planned. He went into town early, went straight to Miller's Hardware and Supply, where Silas Henderson usually spent his afternoons chatting with the owner, and found the man exactly where he expected to see him, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. There were 2 customers in the store besides the clerk. Caleb recognized them as local people. Caleb walked in, stood in the middle of the store and waited for Silas to notice him. It took a moment, but when Silas turned and saw the young man standing there, something crossed the older man's face for a second before he could rearrange his expression. "Caleb," Silas said, with a careful tone that hadn't been there before. "I need to talk to you," Caleb said, his voice controlled. "Right here in front of everyone." Silas looked at the others in the store. "This isn't the place for—" "It's the place you chose," said Caleb, and there was a firmness in his voice that surprised even himself, "because it was in a place like this, or maybe right here, that you spread lies about my father's mushrooms." The silence that settled in the store was the kind that makes people stay quiet, even when they don't want to. "My father worked this land his whole life," Caleb went on. "Honestly, without hurting anyone, without taking what belonged to others. And for 12 years, you used his fence to dump the sawdust from your sawmill because you knew he wouldn't fight back, because he's the type who swallows things and keeps working anyway." Caleb paused. He took a slow breath. "But spreading lies about the product he's making honestly is the most cowardly thing a man can do." Caleb's eyes were wet, but his voice never wavered. Silas was left speechless for a moment that lasted longer than comfortable. He looked away toward the clerk, who glanced aside. The 2 customers had heard everything and didn't move. "I don't know what you're talking about," Silas finally said, in a voice that no longer had its earlier confidence. "Everyone here knows," said Caleb, "and the town is small." He turned his back and walked out without waiting for a reply. When he got home and told what he'd done, Arthur stood in the kitchen looking at his son for a length of time Caleb couldn't quite measure. There was something in his father's face that the young man couldn't fully read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't exactly pride. It was more like recognition, as if Arthur was seeing in his son something he himself had carried in a different way his whole life, and that had finally found the same root in his child. "You didn't have to do that," Arthur said. "Yes, I did," said Caleb. Simple as that, without explanation. Arthur went to the sink, washed his hands that were already clean, and stood with his back turned for a moment. "Thank you," he said, for the second time in a few days. But this time it came out differently, deeper, with more layers. The professor's report arrived on the third day as promised. It was a technical document written in simple, clear language, certifying that the substrate used in the cultivation was composed exclusively of natural organic material in an advanced stage of composting, with no presence of synthetic compounds or any substance that could pose a risk to the product. Rachel reviewed the document, added her own technical note with the data from the samples she had collected herself, and the two sent it to the Blue Ridge Farmers Alliance by email and by mail. But the professor went beyond that. Before even finishing the formal study, he published a preliminary note on a network of agronomic researchers, describing the process of soil transformation on the property as remarkable from the perspective of spontaneous organic composting and worthy of scientific documentation. The note was short and technical, without naming names, but it circulated among professionals in the field, was shared by other researchers, and reached the hands of a journalist from a regional publication specializing in small producers and local agrarian issues. The journalist called Rachel. Rachel called Arthur. "He wants to do a story about the property," she said. "A story for what?" said Arthur, with that instinctive distrust of someone who has never seen anything good come their way for the first time. "To show what's happening here, the soil process, the cultivation, what you've built." "I didn't build anything. Nature built it." "Arthur," she said, with the patience of someone repeating a truth the other hasn't yet accepted, "nature used what was dumped by your fence for 12 years. You stayed on the land when most would have left. You saw where others saw only a problem. That's as much you as it is nature." Silence on the other end. "You can send the reporter," Arthur said finally. The reporter arrived one afternoon, young, with a simple voice recorder and a notepad. He walked the property with Arthur and Caleb, asked questions about the land, about the sawdust, about the cultivation, about the process. Arthur answered with his usual words, short and direct. Caleb filled in with data from the black notebook, which had become a surprisingly detailed documentation of the process from the start. The reporter stayed for over 2 hours and left with pages full of notes, took photos of the cultivation, the fence, the dark soil next to the substrate. The article was published the following week. It had photos of the cultivation, the mushrooms already ripe and ready for harvest, the dark soil next to the substrate. It had the professor's technical data and Rachel's comments, and there was a central idea running through the entire article, which Arthur had mentioned in passing during the interview when the reporter asked how he would describe what had happened. That 12 years of a neighbor's neglect had turned, without anyone planning it, into the foundation of something new. Not in a poetic way, in a literal way. The name of the property appeared in print for the first time in a news outlet, not because of debt, not because of bankruptcy, not because of a dispute, but for something no one had yet called resilience. But that was exactly what it was. The Blue Ridge Farmers Alliance called 2 days after the publication. The older representative was direct and without preamble. "We received the professor's technical report, read the article, and had an internal conversation. We want to pick up the conversation about supply." Arthur was sitting in the kitchen when he got the call. Caleb was beside him working on the notebook. Mary was on the porch sewing a hem. "You can come whenever you want," Arthur said. The representatives came the following week. This time there were 3 of them, including the technical coordinator of the Blue Ridge Farmers Alliance, a middle-aged man with the seriousness of someone who doesn't make a visit without purpose. They spent the entire morning on the property, reviewed the reports, examined the cultivation closely, talked with Rachel about the expected production capacity for the coming months, and about the expansion plans Caleb had outlined in the black notebook. At the end of the morning, they sat at the kitchen table. Mary made coffee and set it on the table without anyone asking. The coordinator opened a folder. "We're proposing a 12-month exclusive supply pre-contract," he said. "The agreed price per kilo is here." He pushed the paper toward Arthur. Arthur looked. He looked at it for a while. Then he passed the paper to Caleb without saying a word. Caleb read it. He was silent for a second that seemed long. "This price," Caleb said, calculating, "covers the debt with the First National Farmers Bank and then some." "It covers it and leaves plenty for reinvestment in the structure," said the coordinator. Arthur kept looking at the paper for a time that seemed longer than it was. Then he picked up the pen that was on the table and signed it, with the steady handwriting of someone who signs important things as if they were simple. He didn't make a speech. He didn't cry. He shook hands firmly with the three representatives and then walked to the window with his back to everyone, pretending to check something in the yard while the sun beat down on the old wooden fence outside. Mary, from the porch, had heard everything. She was silent, her eyes moist, looking at her brother from a distance. Caleb looked at his aunt. She nodded slightly, but there was still an unsettled account with Silas Henderson. Silas found out about the article and the pre-contract from 3 different people on the same day, because the town was small and news travels faster than any car. And contrary to what Arthur had hoped, the neighbor did not stay quiet. 2 days later, he sent an intermediary to the property with a verbal message. He wanted to talk to settle the outstanding matters amicably, without any formal proceedings. The intermediary was a man around 60 years old, whom Arthur knew by sight, the owner of a small store in town, and who was clearly in that role more out of discomfort than willingness. Arthur listened to the message, stayed silent for a good while with his eyes on the ground, and then said in a calm voice, "Tell Silas I'll only talk to him directly, and any conversation will be with my sister, present as a witness." The intermediary left with the visible relief of someone who had finished a task they never wanted to start. He came back 2 days later with the answer, Silas accepted the conditions. Mary found out and said nothing, but the night before the meeting she didn't sleep well. She tossed and turned in her mother's bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about things she couldn't quite sort out. Arthur didn't sleep either. The two met in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, each with a cup of coffee in hand, sitting at the same table where they had grown up, under the same yellowish light bulb their father had installed years before. "Are you going to collect Dad's money?" Mary asked, holding the cup with both hands. "No," Arthur said. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" He looked at the cup for a moment. "It's about that man never dumping sawdust on my fence again, and never trying to take what's mine again." Mary nodded slowly. There was a wisdom in that which she recognized as coming from their father, from a streak the two had inherited and hadn't always known how to use the right way. The meeting took place on the porch of the property, on an afternoon of cold wind that made the orchard leaves sway. Silas arrived in the white pickup truck, with the same straw hat, but without his usual smile. There was something in his posture different from every other time Arthur had stood before that man over 12 years. A kind of caution the other had never needed to use before when talking to Arthur. Mary was sitting on a wooden chair on the porch with the shoebox in her lap. Arthur was standing leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Silas sat in the chair that had been placed for him and looked at the two with a quick assessment, like someone sizing up the terrain. "I came to settle things," he said, with a controlled voice. Mary placed the shoebox on the porch table without saying a word and took out the receipt. The wind hit the orchard leaves. She put the paper in front of Silas. His face changed when he saw the paper. Arthur watched that change closely because he had been waiting for it. The man tried to keep a neutral expression, but there was something in his eyes that slipped out for a second before he could control it again. "That's from a long time ago," Silas said. 26 years, said Mary with that calm that was different from resignation. "That matter is already settled." "How?" she said. "When?" "Because there's no document showing payment. No receipt, no transfer, nothing with your signature on it." Silas fell silent. The wind blew again. Arthur moved away from the doorframe and walked to the table. He stood looking at the neighbor from a different position than any he had taken in the last 12 years. There was no anger on his face. There was something harder to dismantle than anger. "Silas, I'm not here to collect what's my father's," he said, with that calm voice that had cost him so much to build. "My father trusted you because you were from the same land. He lent what he had when you needed it. That was his. It's part of life, and it's not coming back." Pause. "But if there's one more truckload of sawdust on my fence, if there's one more rumor about my product in Asheville, if there's any action, direct or not, against what I'm building on this property, Every single page of this document will appear in every place I can show it." He paused. "And there's one more thing." Silas looked at him. "My son is careful. He keeps everything, including the video filmed at dawn on the 12th day of cultivation, which shows your truck's license plate and sawdust being dumped by the fence after hours, after I asked you to stop. It has a date, it has a time, it has a license plate." A silence that lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. "I never said I sent that truck at dawn," said Silas, but his voice came out weaker than it should have. "The truck's license plate says it," said Caleb, who had appeared at the porch door without Silas noticing. He stood there, phone in hand. "I have the video here if you want to see it." Silas stared at the three of them, at his sister with the receipt in her hand, at Arthur standing on his own land, at the son in the doorway. Then he stood up, put his hat on his head, and walked away down the path back to his pickup without signing anything, without making a promise, without saying another word. But the trucks never came back. Not the next day, not the following week, not in the months that followed. The dirt road stayed quiet on Tuesday mornings. The old wooden fence stopped being pushed against, and the yellow mountain that had been the symbol of 12 years of humiliation stayed there, being absorbed into the earth, doing the work it had started without anyone asking. The following months were the most labor-intensive Arthur had lived through since the days he worked the fields with his father when he was still young. The advance from the pre-contract with the Blue Ridge Farmers Alliance paid off the debt with the First National Farmers Bank with days to spare, and with what was left, they began building a more suitable structure with purchased materials, more stable than the slats and screens of the first phase. Caleb designed the new structure in the black notebook with an attention to detail that Rachel said was rare in someone who hadn't formally studied for it. 2 young people from the community started working on the property. The first was an 18-year-old boy, the son of a neighboring small farmer who had lost part of his crop to a bad frost the previous winter and urgently needed work. The second was a 20-year-old girl named Jessica, who had taken a technical course in agriculture and couldn't find a job in the field. Caleb trained them with a patience he didn't know he had, using the black notebook as a guide and answering their questions with the data he had recorded from the start. Arthur watched from a distance, working alongside without saying anything, but there was something in the way he looked at his son teaching the younger ones that told a story he couldn't put into words. Professor Douglas brought students from the State Agricultural University for a field class one morning in October. There were 8 young people with notebooks and measuring instruments who arrived in a university car and walked around the property with the professor for over 2 hours. Arthur stood in the middle of the yard watching those young people crouch over the soil, collecting samples, taking notes, asking the professor questions with an energy he recognized as the energy of someone discovering something. Caleb answered several of the students' questions with a fluency that made the professor smile more than once. After the students left, Douglas stood for a moment next to Arthur, both of them looking at the cultivation strip. "Your son has a natural talent for this," said the professor. Arthur looked over to where Caleb was still talking to one of the students, who had stayed to ask one more question. "He always has," said Arthur slowly. "I just took a while to see it." The professor didn't answer, but there was something in the way Arthur said it that was different from ordinary pride. It was a pride that carried with it the awareness of how long it had taken to get there. Rachel kept coming monthly, as she had promised. On one of those visits, on an October afternoon with the smell of fresh earth in the air, she stood for a moment next to Arthur, while the two looked at the cultivation structure that had grown since the first version of slats and screens. "You know this case is going to appear in a teaching material at the State Agricultural University," she said. "The professor told me. How do you feel about that?" Arthur was silent for a moment. "I feel like someone who spent 12 years looking at something they thought was a problem, and it was something else," he said. "I'm not sure what to call that feeling." Rachel looked at him. "It's called learning," she said. Arthur almost smiled. Mary went back to the neighboring county 2 weeks after the conversation with Silas. Before catching the bus, she stayed in the kitchen with her brother, drinking coffee early in the morning, as they had done so many times when they were children and still slept under the same roof in that same house. "Dad would have liked to see this," she said, looking out the window at the strip of cultivation that stretched along the fence. Arthur stared at his coffee for a moment. "I know. He always said this land held more than we could see." "He was the type who said those things," said Arthur with the corner of a smile that only appeared when he talked about his father. He was. And he was right. There was something Arthur wanted to say that circled inside him before coming out. "Mary, that little box you brought." He paused. "When Mom told you about the receipt, did she know it would matter one day?" His sister was silent for a second. "She said she kept it because someday Arthur would need to know he wasn't completely without resources in a fight." Pause. "She knew you better than you think." Arthur kept looking at his cup. "Thanks for bringing it," he said. "Thanks for staying," she said. She grabbed her bag, went to the gate, turned once and waved. He waved back, and then she disappeared down the dirt road while the morning was still cold, and Arthur stood at the gate until the bus's dust settled. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us folks just starting out a lot. Now continuing. November arrived with a golden sun that struck the hills from the side and made the property look different every hour of the day. The orchard on the left side of the fence, which for years hadn't produced as it should due to lack of attention and resources, had received its first care with the advance money and was already showing signs it would pay off. Caleb had started waking up before his father some mornings and would go to the cultivation structure to check conditions before anyone else was up. There was a ritual in that which he had created without realizing it, and it gave him a quiet satisfaction he hadn't felt in many years. The first official delivery to the Blue Ridge Farmers Alliance happened on a November morning. They were simple wooden boxes, lined with paper with shiitake mushrooms carefully harvested over the previous week. Caleb had supervised the harvest and packing with the black notebook in his hand, checking weight, appearance, moisture. The cooperative's truck stopped in front of the property at 7 in the morning. Arthur stood next to Caleb during the loading. When the truck drove off down the dirt road, Caleb turned to his father. "First delivery," he said. "First of many," said Arthur. It was the closest thing to a celebration the two knew how to do, and for them, it was enough. But the story wouldn't be complete without a moment that came late, on an ordinary late November afternoon that didn't seem to have anything special about it until it did. Arthur was alone at the edge of the fence, checking the growing structure, when Caleb came walking up from behind with his hands in his pockets and his face in the descending sun. They stood side by side for a while, looking at the stretch of cultivation that extended the entire length, where for 12 years the sawdust had arrived as waste. The sun was going down behind the hills. The smell of damp earth was in the air. The pines on the hills were blue in the distance. "Dad," Caleb said after a while. "Yeah. I bought bus tickets to leave 3 times. Arthur remained silent. "I know," he said. Caleb turned his face to his father. "You knew? I found the first ticket in the pocket of your pants you left for me to wash, about 2 years ago." Caleb stared ahead for a moment. "And you didn't say anything." What was I going to say? Another silence. The wind moved the leaves of the orchard to the left. "I stayed because I wanted to," Caleb said slowly. "I know. I didn't stay for you. I stayed for the land." "I know that too. But now—" The young man paused for exactly the right amount of time. "Now I stay for both." Arthur didn't turn his face. He kept looking at the strip of cultivation stretching before them for a moment. The dark, rich earth, the mushrooms still growing for the next harvest, the old fence that had been the stage of humiliation for 12 years and was now the boundary of a property that had found something new where before there was only despair. Then he put his hand on his son's shoulder with that firm, brief pressure that was all he knew how to give when words couldn't handle what needed to be said. Caleb placed his hand over his father's for a second, and they stood there, the two of them, looking at the place where for 12 years only the waste of another man had arrived, and which now produced something real, something valuable, something neither of them had known how to dream of 2 months earlier, when the papers from the First National Farmers Bank were in the drawer, and the silence between them had the weight of years. What Silas Henderson threw there for 12 years, thinking he was getting rid of a problem, ended up being, against all expectations, the foundation of a new beginning. Not because life was fair, because it rarely is, but because a stubborn, proud, and suffering man refused the idea that what is dumped on you defines who you are, and because his son learned, without anyone needing to teach it in words, that the land that seems finished is sometimes just waiting for someone to look at it from a different angle. The old wooden fence was still standing, worn by time, with crooked posts and some boards that needed replacing, but on the inside of it, the earth was rich and dark and fragrant, and there grew something that had its roots in 12 years of sawdust, deposited without love and slowly transformed into life. And on that November afternoon, with the sun going down and the hills turning blue in the distance, Arthur Miller stood looking at the fence that had been the stage of so much humiliation and saw in it, for the first time, a boundary worth defending. End of story. Tell us what you thought of this story. Where are you watching us from? Leave it in the comments, like the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this.